Professor Greenewalt, and this is government. This is Congress and lawmaking. This is the last video that we will have for this semester for this class. This particular video will be on Congress and budgeting. Okay? This is something that I want you to pay close attention to in your textbook. There's no way I can give the same amount of information or the same level of detail that you'll find in your textbook, and I'd like you to comb the pages of your textbook very carefully on this subject of Congress and budgeting. Let's look, however, at budgetary patterns that we've seen develop in the federal government over time. We find there's two specific budgetary patterns that have come to symbolize everything that's wrong with the federal government. Number one is the inability to balance its budget. And number two is the persistent chronic growth of federal expenditures. Well, what are the patterns? What are the patterns of expenditure growth? We find that during the last 75 years, there have been three elements, there have been three components of federal expenditures which help explain the growth in federal outlays. What might they be? Well, number one is the rapid increase in defense spending. That really took off after 9/11, of course. After 9/11, it leads us to wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and world policemen responsibilities, particularly in the Middle East, to try to protect Western Europe in particular and the United States or the NATO countries from terrorism. The second component has been new federal income assistance programs. We have new federal income assistance programs. That's very timely to be talking about that now, the time of this virus scare, along with the expansion of the benefits of older programs. The third component of federal expenditures, which helps to explain the growth in outlays, is that we've seen federal grants for state and local governments grow and grow and grow as well. Well, the federal budget has been the subject of reform, and there have been attempts to reform the federal budgeting process. We find that there have been a number of reforms enacted during the 20th century that sought to improve budgeting, and it sought to improve budgeting by giving budgeteers better information about the budget. The first attempt at this we find in 1921. It's a very famous act for those of you who've taken public administration. You're well aware of the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921. The Budget and Accounting Act of 1921 did what? It mandated a comprehensive budget. We now have to have a comprehensive budget with last year's budget, this year's budget, and the budget for the next year to come. It created the Bureau of the Budget. And the Bureau of the Budget was set up, the BOB was set up specifically to provide the President with financial information. And it created the General Accounting Office. The General Accounting Office was to be an appendage of Congress, and it was created to give Congress the ability to audit federal spending. Well, in 1969, we had the adoption of the Unified Budget. And the Unified Budget in 1969 essentially was an attempt to implement the recommendations of a 1967 Presidential Commission on Budget Concepts, the President's Commission on Budget Concepts. And what the Unified Budget tried to do is to make the budget more comprehensive and more understandable. This takes us to 1974 in this decade of reforms in the Congress of the 1970s, when we had the Congressional Budget Act of 1974, which you've read about many times. The Congressional Budget Act of 1974 requires Congress to examine and vote on the budget in its entirety, complete budget. And it created the Congressional Budget Office. Most importantly, it created the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, And the Congressional Budget Office provided Congress with the same type of budgetary expertise that the President had with the Bureau of the Budget. And under the Nixon administration, the Bureau of the Budget was renamed the Office of Management and Budget to more clearly and accurately reflect its role. The OMB, the old BOB, no longer just did the budget formation for the President, but it studied types of executive organization and executive procedures, and it was a all-purpose administrative consultant for the presidency. Well, you had the Congressional Budget Act of 1974. Now, we had persistent deficits, and we had an almost uncontrolled rate of federal expenditure growth in the late 1960s and in the early 1970s. And they're really one of the main reasons for the adoption of the Congressional Budget Act of 1974. So again, these persistent deficits in the Vietnam War, while we're trying to win the war in Vietnam and we're trying to end poverty simultaneously in Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. So you have these persistent budgetary deficits and what seems to be an uncontrolled rate of federal expenditure growth. The federal budget just continues to grow and grow every year. And we find the Congressional Budget Act of 1974 tried to give greater control of the budget to the Congress by giving it a way to vote on the budget in an informed manner, as well as giving the public more information. The American public has held and continues to hold contradictory attitudes on this subject. The American public really wants balanced budgets, but they want fewer federal expenditures, and they want us to support, they want greater levels of support for their favorite federal programs. So they want balanced budgets, they want fewer federal expenditures, but they want more federal support for their favorite programs. Very contradictory, isn't it? Well, we have six proposals that we can set forth for future budgetary recommendations. If we are to improve the federal budgetary process, let's take a look at these six proposals. Number one is to create and adopt multi-year budgets, which would allow Congress to target better and plan to achieve its economic goals far more effectively. So the adoption of multi-year budget targets. Secondly, we perhaps should consider the adoption of sunset legislation. Sunset legislation essentially says that there's no federal program that will live forever, that when we create a federal program, that it has a sunset date on it, and that it'll be good for 10 years. And after 10 years, say the General Accounting Office has to take a good hard look at it and see if it's needed anymore. And if it's needed anymore, Congress would have to reauthorize it. And if it wasn't reauthorized by Congress, it would be discontinued. So a second proposal is the adoption of sunset legislation. The third proposal is to move agencies that are off budget on budget, so that Congress can increase the comprehensiveness, if you will, of its budgetary decision making. And what we're talking about off budget agencies would be agencies such as the CIA. You can still move the CIA on budget and disguise what its programs are and its expenditures, but it would be good to certainly include it in the total figure that we would be looking at for a federal budget for a certain year. Fourthly, we ought to consider the creation of a credit budget so that credit programs can be compared to direct expenditures. Fifthly, we need to include tax expenditures in our annual budget. Tax expenditures or tax subsidies then could be compared to direct expenditure subsidies. So we want to include tax expenditures in an annual budget decision making so that tax subsidies can be compared to direct budget subsidies. Number 6, we should require additional types of 5-year cost estimates and program evaluations so that Congress can see the full implications, implications, excuse me. It can see the full implications of a program over the course of its life. Now, Davidson has a review of the federal budget process, and I want you to take a good hard look at that and to commit that to memory. The federal budget process. It appears on pages 412 to 429 in Davidson. In your Davidson book on Congress and its members, between 412 and 429, you'll see this review of the federal budget process. I'd like you to take a good hard look at that. And this brings us to our conclusion. We find that in our conclusion that we've had federal budgetary patterns, and these federal budgetary patterns, until recent years, the bias of representative government towards expenditure growth and deficits, it's been restrained. It was restrained by a deeply held belief that budgets should be balanced. And that has evaporated, hasn't it, ladies and gentlemen? In addition, the power of certain institutions, the power of the institution of the presidency, the Office of Management and Budget, the leadership of the Congress, and the leadership of political parties have traditionally all acted as a brake against the demands of special interest groups. That seems to have evaporated as well. We seem to no longer have national leaders that have the ability to say no to interest groups and their demands. So we have a budget that continues to escalate way out of sight, and we'll see if we can ever bring that under control. And that will be a task that will fall on your shoulders, ladies and gentlemen, because my generation didn't do its job. We will you'll be receiving more information by email on your final exam. And if you'd like your scores for your midterm, all you have to do is send me an email and I'll get those out to you. So watch your email for your final exam. And I hope to see you soon back at Millersville. It's been a pleasure having all of you in this class. My email and phone are always open for any conversations you want to have. If you want advice on graduate schools or internships, give me a call. I'm proud of each and every one of you. Talk to you soon.
Well, Gamut's not opening until September, and of course I have to find out through my sister who